Hello and welcome to Outward, Slate's LGBT podcast. I am Jules Gill-Peterson, and as you know, I am not a medical doctor. I just play one in long peer-reviewed books. No, I am a scholar, among other things, of trans medicine and the history of trans medicine. And I'm really excited because even though I seem to bring that up a lot on episodes, and we do get into it fairly often, today we have a real treat for you. I'm going to sit down and talk to Eli Lawliet, who is a gender doula, and we're going to get into why that is sort of a new phrase coming up today for something that has actually taken many different forms for a very long time, but maybe is particularly important both in this moment where transition is being restricted and criminalized, but also where there aren't as many social supports for trans people looking to get the most out of their transitions or just to get access to the things that they need as there used to be. It's a really interesting, very kind of mind-expanding conversation with a lot of food for thought. So stick around for that. We are going to take a short break, but when we come back, I will be speaking with the gender doula, Eli Lawliet. And we are back. It's no secret that all the things we label healthcare are distributed mostly by class and race in this country. And as abortion, reproductive and gestational care, and medical transition have all been pretty aggressively criminalized in recent years, some of those new laws are really taking their place on top of a much older truth that maybe never quite got as much attention, which is that even when they are legal, abortion, transition, a lot of other things have and continue to be effectively out of reach for way too many people who want them or need them. And even when people technically have access, the quality of that care and its delivery can often cause just as much direct harm as they alleviate. But one of the words you've maybe heard traveling around these kinds of conversations or these kinds of problems is the term doula. I think maybe the most recognizable type of doula, at least to me, would be a person who's present to offer guidance or support to someone during labor, delivery, and postpartum. But there are quite a number of different kinds of doulas out there today, including abortion doulas, who I shouted out on a recent episode of this pod, but also gender doulas. Eli Lawliet is one of the latter. He holds a PhD and had been researching trans healthcare for around a decade when he decided to translate some of those insights into a whole new modality by becoming a gender doula, which I'm really excited to hear more about and get into today. So Eli, welcome to Outward. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Oh my gosh, me too. Well, I mean, maybe first of all, I wonder if we could just get down to some brass tacks just so everyone feels up to speed. I'm really curious, how do you define sort of broadly what a doula is or does? And then maybe specifically, how would you sum up what a gender doula is or does specifically?
Yeah, so to me, doulas exist in our current culture as a direct result of a lack of community, right? So I think that often in whatever space they are operating, doulas fulfill a space that might have once been fulfilled by aunties and grandmas and other people in the community, maybe even dear friends. In the birth space, that happens through being present in the time leading up to birth, during birth or after, postpartum, or like you said, for abortion and other sort of reproductive related care in a capacity where you are medically adjacent, you are in the medical rooms and you have a working knowledge of what's going on medically, but you're not actually a medical provider, which I think allows space to support someone in a way that is far more intimate than a medical provider often will support someone, but highly informed. And that's part of the reason why I chose doula as the framework for what I do as a gender doula, because I am medical adjacent in a lot of ways. As you mentioned, I have a pretty extensive background in research about trans medicine, and I understand a lot about trans medicine, but I'm not a medical doctor, and I don't give medical advice, but I do give how to navigate the medical system advice, right? And I also support people in many, many other ways ways, covering the full spectrum of gender exploration and gender questioning and gender transition. So that sort of aspect of being both medical adjacent, but also sort of like coming in and supporting in myriad ways that maybe could have or would have been provided by community in a different cultural context. That to me is what it means to do doula work.
Oh, that's fascinating. There's so much there I want to ask you more about. Yeah, could you say a little bit more about like how you got into this work? Like I alluded to your academic background in part because I totally identify as being someone adjacent to the medical field. I also don't, at least I don't give qualified medical advice. But yeah, how did you get into this? And maybe like what was there a moment? Was there like a particular motivation? Or yeah, how is that like transition from doing research into trying to think about how to play this really particular and complex role you're just outlining? Like how did that happen in your life?
It's a complicated story, but I'm going to try to condense it. Essentially, I was listening to a podcast and there was a full spectrum doula on that podcast. Yeah. It was a tarot podcast. And the full spectrum birth doula was talking about how doulas function. And her name is Erica Livingston. She happened to mention that she believes we need doulas for every threshold of life. At the time, I was a second year PhD student and I was applying to law school. And I had this like thunderbolt of like, oh, we need transition doulas, right? That was the word that came to me in the moment. Again, it's a long story, but basically over the course of the next several months, I was also engaging in a very intense chronic illness journey. I was working with a trans body worker, and every time that I was in that space, it's just this idea of gender doula wouldn't leave me alone. And after many months of this and much suffering in my life, I was like, oh, I think I'm being called. Like, I think this is a calling. And I started to turn toward it. And through a number of very wild circumstances, I really I guess dropped into the fact that I was being called and that this was my next move and that it was possible, because at the time it didn't exist. And so I then started to pursue it, and I contacted the doula that I had heard on the podcast, and I was like, hey, I had this idea listening to you, and I wonder if you've ever heard of this before. And she was like, no, but like, I'll train you. And so I came and did a doula mentorship with her and her doula partner, Laura Interlandi. And I did 2 rounds of doula mentorship with them to kind of round out my skill set, right? Because I had this like profound academic background, but I didn't have the doula skills. And that was sort of how I got started in that process.
Yeah. So it's interesting because you just said, okay, there wasn't necessarily this specific compound, phrase, gender doula at the time, but also I think when you were giving your definition of what a gender doula is, I mean, it was definitely very much embedded in much longer, different histories, but also about something changing over time. I was really caught on what you said about thinking about forms of support that might have been provided by a tangible set of people in a different time and place or in a different cultural context. And so I'm wondering, particularly when it comes to trans people, I mean, this isn't like a uniform thing. Obviously, the forms of social, familial, interpersonal, economic support that you have are probably largely sort along actually gender lines, but also along class and race lines. But I'm sort of curious, thinking about trans people, I know you don't only work with trans people, but thinking about trans people in particular, as part of like what support means is sort of like filling a kind of gap or like a kind of isolation that has kind of grown up around trans people, not only in relation to transition or healthcare, but more broadly speaking, right? Like if you're housing insecure, if you don't have like a stable income stream, if you've been rejected by your family, I'm just thinking of so many different ways that what you're talking about might manifest. Is that kind of right? Am I on the right track there?
Yeah, I mean, it's very fascinating, right? Because I think that, I mean, you're a trans historian. You've seen, in our history, there's all of these little ways that we've supported one another, right? And I do think that while putting all of this into a framework of gender doula is new, there is a much longer and richer history of trans communities sort of forming and coming together and like creating spaces where we could support one another. And that wasn't true for everyone, of course. Like there's been many trans people who've been sort of isolated from other trans people, throughout history. But there's also many different sort of communities or groups or networks that have formed where people have been like, okay, like here, let me take you under my wing. Let me teach you what this is. Let me show you how to get care. Like that is something that has existed and has been prevalent in especially certain geographical areas, right, over time. And so I guess the thing that I'm doing is pulling that all under an umbrella and making it like a professional profession, I guess, making it a professional service. But it has existed in many different iterations over time in a more informal way.
I'm running through my mental Rolodex of a whole bunch of examples I could think of, which are always so fascinating. I'm kind of curious about what sort of examples come to mind of like the kind of support that you're providing, maybe even just like in like a literal healthcare setting, because, there's like, I don't know, I mean, these are probably experiences that like listeners can relate to, whether they're trans or not, about like why you, for example, I don't know, it's just a very basic example, but like you might not want to go to a doctor's appointment alone, just like in general. Yeah. But I'm sure it goes way beyond that. So I'm just super curious, like what do you feel most like passionate talking about?
I don't know. There's so many. I mean, I think that one thing that's really fascinating that I think about sometimes is like what changed in the mid 20th century when they started to sort of have the information clearinghouse, like where you could like write. It was like the Ericson Foundation.
The Ericson Educational Foundation.
Yes,
yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. Founded by private, I think there's a trans man named Reed Ericson from Louisiana who inherited a bunch of money. I think it was oil money, actually. Mm-hmm. But who basically philanthropically founded a lot of the private medical clinics in the 1960s that created the medical model we still use today, but also created, this foundation, the Ericson Educational Foundation, which was the outfit that provided grants to medical professionals, but also created a referral service, a newsletter, and was sort of, like you were saying, the clearinghouse. So if you lived in, Wichita, Kansas, you could write to the Ericson Educational Foundation, say, hello, I'm a nice transsexual girl from Wichita. Can you tell me who's the psychiatrist and endocrinologist in town? And they would, write back to you. Yeah. But anyways, please go on.
So that's what you said at the end there is exactly why I reached for that first, right? Because it's like folks who were in these locales where they didn't necessarily have access to a trans community or like a group of folks, they could write to the Ericson Educational Foundation and get information, right? Or, ostensibly find some way to tap into support. And also we see this if you look in like the archives of like magazines that would be circulated or like newsletters that would be circulated, right? And because when I first decided to do this work, I had conceived of it as hyper local. I'm in Los Angeles. I'll serve people in Los Angeles. But the first person who sought me for services lived across the country in the South. And so I was like, wow, I'm going to have to redo my conception of how these services are provided because I don't know enough other people to be able to refer people to local folks who are doing this work. And so I started off from this sort of like mindset of like, I'm going to do my best to serve everyone everywhere. Until I can build up a sufficient network of gender doulas, that I don't necessarily have to do that anymore. And so that's why I reached for that example. But of course, you also see, even when we look at something like, ballroom culture or Paris is Burning, you have these families with like mothers, right? And not that was always necessarily or ever just about transition, but there was a huge part of that was about like shepherding people through what it meant to be a trans or a queer person, especially person of color in that context, in that time. And like a lot of support, material support and emotional and mental support came from those family clusters, right? So that would be a more sort of like localized version of this type of support that looks very different from what I offer, but is also sort of a legacy of trans care networks.
Really speaking my language here. I love it. Love getting to talk about these things. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, continue my conversation with Eli Lawliet. one of the things that I kind of have been thinking a lot about in my own research too is about what has changed, since those earlier periods. And, some of those things are just broad economic and social changes in the United States that maybe land differently for different groups of queer and trans people, but actually are things they probably mostly have in common with other people. And one of those is actually just genuinely like isolation and, austerity and the privatization of the public world, the retreat of the welfare state, income inequality, the rising cost of living, longer commutes, working longer hours, higher debt loads. All these things actually like create compounded forms of isolation. And, family structures, kinship structures and households have changed a lot since, say, like the 50s and the 60s. And so that's sort of interesting to me, the ways we try to fill the gaps, right? About feeling sort of on our own, facing things that are impersonal and structural, kind of on the individual level. And so if something like that is like, how can I, transition, that's like a big life question. Or how could I figure out, how to live in the world as the gender that I've spent some time working on. Those are challenging things to face by yourself. But I also, tend to think that like over time, then the way people have come to those dilemmas has changed, that they've become more individual over time, right? Like talk about ballroom or talk about that history, say, of poor trans women, like they didn't really do like identity work, in order to transition. Just like having an identity historically is a fairly kind of bougie thing, having privacy and space and time to think about yourself. But anyways, like I'm sort of curious that like, are the kinds of things that you're finding bring people to want to work with you, are they still very much these practical kinds of questions? I'm just so curious how people are understanding like what the challenges or obstacles are today to getting what they want out of their life and their body and their gender.
Yeah, that's such
huge
a great question.
But
no, but it's really good. And I think really important because it's all of the above in a big way. But it's fascinating, right? Because on the one hand, I work with people at this point internationally, and I've worked with, and I've worked with people from multiple different countries all over the world. And the bulk of my folks are still in the United States, but I have a burgeoning Canadian population of my people that I talk to and other people across the globe. And so one thing that's been interesting for me is how does the work change when you don't have a very high level working knowledge of the medical system and the insurance system. Yeah. Because in the United States, a huge part of what I studied academically was the system. And I also paid very close attention, not just to what was happening for me insurance wise, but what was happening for people I was researching with, and also people that I just knew. And so I have like a pretty robust, and I wouldn't say like I'm an expert in United States insurance, but I have a pretty robust understanding of how to navigate it as a trans person, if that makes sense. Whereas when it comes to like the NHS or like the Canadian healthcare system, they're very different from one another. They're very different from the United States. What's happening, in Australia or New Zealand is very different from what's happening, And so with all these sort of differences, it does change the flavor of what I can do with people in certain ways. And then also kind of not, which is fascinating. Like there are still a lot of existential questions. And for some of my clients, existential is what all we talk about, like they have maybe very good support medically and they don't really need my support for that, but they maybe need to talk about their gender and their process and like how to handle the more social aspects of transition, and for some people it's totally logistics. Like, okay, how are we going to find you a doctor? How are we going to find you a therapist? How are we going to get you a surgery? How are we going to file a grievance because your insurance denied your surgery, and so it's that whole song and dance. And then some folks, it changes over time. I'm a very spiritual person. And one of the things that has changed over time is that more people are coming to me now for spiritual support. And that's, been in the last year or so really shifting. And then some folks who initially came to me for gender support have sort of like organically shifted into ongoing spiritual support clients, which has been very fascinating. And the side of my work that is about like creating ritual has become more and more prevalent in the sort of breakdown of what I'm doing on any given day.
Oh, could you say more about that? I'm curious because, like, I feel like I've just been seeing this twinkling going on too. Like, I don't know, on the internet, talking to people, that the term spiritual is coming up more commonly. But when you said ritual, I was like, oh, right. Like, you know, what needs more ritual just to like get through the experience, pace it out differently, and feel it out differently? Being medicalized and psychiatrized in a dehumanizing way. But
Mm-hmm.
anyways, don't want to presume that's what you're talking about. But yeah, can you say a little bit more about it? I'm so curious.
Yeah, this is like one of my most beloved topics. Well, first of all, to sort of ground this in where I'm coming from, because spiritual means different things to different people. I was raised conservative Christian. That never vibed with me. I was sort of like a hardcore atheist for many years. And then I got to grad school and was like, uh-oh, my body and life are falling apart and I need something.
In there.
Yeah. So I tried to think about what spirituality would look like for me, a person who is deathly allergic to organized religion. And when I looked at like sort of like new age or, you know, pagan types of spirituality, most of it was like white supremacist or transphobic or just gross or didn't appeal to me. So I was like, this is not for me either. So what do I do? And the only thing I could think of that felt like adequate soil for me to root into was transness and queerness. So I was like, what does the spirituality look like if you base it in transness? And I've basically spent most of the last decade like working through what that means to me. So that's my spirituality, is very like rooted into transness as a spirituality, as well as so many other things about me and the world. And so when I'm looking at ritual for transition, I think any part of it can become ritualized. But some of the spaces where I found it very potent is when people are first starting HRT, having a ritual about how you take in the hormones in whatever fashion that is can be extremely supportive. And of course, a ritual like that is either daily or weekly, so it needs to be shorter. This is not like a grand ritual, but it does often, especially for folks who have anxiety around injections or things like that. Ritual can really help with that. Rituals to release names and pronouns and to call in new names and pronouns are very impactful. There's a version of that I can also do with a person's community. So it allows the community to affirm the new name and pronoun, like in a group setting, which is very powerful. There's pre-surgery and post-surgery rituals that are really powerful in terms of how you relate to the body and what's being let go and what's being brought in. And then also rituals, more and more these days, rituals for grief and rituals for processing big, life-changing type emotion that's sort of often that we are encouraged to push down and sublimate, like allowing it to come up and be expressed and processed. So those are some of the rituals that I work with.
Wow. I mean, that's major, because talk about the things we are encouraged to set aside. I mean, this is like a hobby horse of mine, but I just think that like the liberal model of trans inclusion is mostly premised on disappearing all of the labor and work involved in transition, and, basically to make non-trans people, feel comfortable, not have to think about anything, not have to be involved in anything, right? Just to be like, congratulations, I say you can be a part of the world as is. And I do think there are a lot of ways that, right, that like other people's anxieties sort of structure people's lived experience of what they're allowed to feel, in a way that's detectable to others, how it manifests and so on. So anxiety seems like such a key word there. And so often I think a lot of the most, I don't know, I'm just thinking about trans youth in particular, but often even just when adults come out, a lot of the way they're mistreated by family and friends or coworkers is in like this like anxious and dismissive, like, aren't we all going through a transition right now? It's like, okay, well, not the same one. I think we're living through an era where there's a lot of fear around transition, and some of that might be like very understandable. It could not be legal inside. It could be a gray zone. You can stand to lose a lot. People still, lose their livelihoods, get kicked out of their homes, lose their scholarships, lose their education, lose their jobs. People go to jail, people go to prison for transitioning, indirectly all the time. So it's not, I don't mean to say an unfounded fear, but that fear has also kind of been, that fear has been spun in ways aesthetic and cultural. And I I'm just sort of curious, is that something that is coming up in the work that you're doing with folks where they're like, I am afraid to do that? Not just like I'm afraid of injecting the needle every week because ouch, but like I'm afraid, even though my brain tells me there's nothing wrong with it, that there is something wrong with like desiring to transition. I feel it's bad, or I don't know. It's like, it can also be gender fear, because I just think that this is one of the least, I don't know, one of the least polite fears to talk about, you know, when it comes to talking about why it's so wonderful, but also so difficult to transition in the world.
100%. And this is also a hobby horse of mine. This year, I've been running a breathwork circle called Breathwork for Trans Liberation. And in my materials, like when I talk about that offering, I say this is a space where we can operate free from cisgender anxiety. And what I mean by that is this sort of consistent and intense anxiety that cis people have around transition, such that trans people have to reduce our conversations around transition to topics that address those anxieties, right? And that often comes with a side effect of performing things that are not accurate to our experience, right? So like performing consistent trans joy all the time, right? Like if I'm around cis people, I have to be like, this is awesome. It's so great. Everything is awesome. My surgery, it was great. Everything was great. And I never felt bad, you know? And it's like, my God, how fucking exhausting. And so I also see this come through in, okay, so I'm going to go back a little bit into history because I know that that's a shared space of love for both of us. So like in the Transsexual Empire Strikes Back piece.
One of the first trans studies texts. Yeah.
Yes. So Sandy Stone in there is like, hey, like we're being critiqued for performing femininity to this extreme degree, but we're having to perform femininity because that's what's been required by the Benjamin standards, basically, which were the standards that everyone was using to access gender affirming care at the time. And she describes how folks accessed the standards, like they bought the book and then they passed it around the community and they learned what they were supposed to say to doctors. And then they would say those things to doctors so that they could get their care, which I love this. This is one of the pieces of trans history that I think about all the time. However, the downstream impact of that is that because we were parodying those standards so often to others and to one another, I think in a real way, we started to believe them. And in a real way, we started to think, wait, if I don't have that story, am I actually even trans? Right? And I see that exact pattern repeat itself again and again in the community, right? Such that now people will hear something repeated again and again on TikTok or whatever social media platform they're on. And if that's not their experience, they're like, oh no, am I even trans? You know, or if they like have a gender affirming surgery and then they have post-surgical depression, which is incredibly common and almost everyone experiences to some degree, they'll be like, but I've seen like videos online where people were crying with joy when they got their bandages off. And after I got my bandages off, I felt bad about my body. Does that mean that I made a horrible mistake? Right? And so like these anxieties, they constrain the conversations we're allowed to have in public. And because of that, they constrain people's understanding of what it means to be trans. And because of that, they make it so that our whole way of being becomes more and more impoverished because we have fewer and fewer spaces where we can just openly speak about the full complexity of transness, which is what lends it its richness. If you hold the pain and the terror and the struggle along with the joy and the transcendence, that's where the real, you know, abundance of transness is and the magic of it. But if we have to sort of falsely prop up this idea of like constant trans joy to fight against the false idea of constant trans sorrow, then we lose all of the magic that happens in the interplay.
Yeah. So well said. I really, really appreciate that. No, it's true. It's like when you have to idealize something to defend yourself, you know, you can rationalize it in your mind, but over time, of course, it has real effects on you in your body unconsciously. And it's difficult not to internalize values that you might know are wrong, but certainly may not feel wrong when that's all you hear every day, all you see on social media or all the New York Times ever has to say about you.
Oh my God, yes.
it seems that part of the reason that doula work is, let's say, more on people's minds at the moment is, like you said, because of material scarcity and because of real deprivation, because of real loss. And I think part of what that presents us with as an opportunity, not just as a sort of besieged moment, is a chance to think about, really what medicalization does. But I'm sort of curious, what kind of wisdom or insight have you gained about the way that non-medicalized or non-medical professional knowledge, practice, and other sorts of things could take on a role inside a medical context? Can we introduce some positive things that might not just be medical or might not just be coming from medical professionals?
Absolutely. So when I was in grad school, one of my big projects was creating like a new model for gender affirming care because there were so many problems with the existing model. And I was like, well, we've got to start somewhere, y'all. And the model that I came up with, I called the gender wellness model. And the idea was that every single person, no matter their identity, has a level of gender wellness that is like sort of optimal. And like these are words that I was using because I was trying to be legible to the medical system, right? But the idea was basically like, hey, we've all got a gender and people need various levels. I mean, I know agender people exist, right? But we all have some way of existing in relationship to this thing that we call gender in this culture, right? And people need different levels of care and intervention to feel positively about where they stand in relationship to gender in this culture, right? And what one person might need is like a support group or a doula. And what one person might need is like 15 surgeries. And rather than ranking these and pathologizing it, just being like, hey, everybody has different needs. And depending on the structures that exist in your body and the needs that you have, that's the care that you're afforded. Because again, like there's so many issues around like, I'm legally male, but I need a hysterectomy. And now insurance is going to have some sort of terrible fit. And I'm going to have to jump through 1,000 burning hoops. So doing away with that as well, just being like, no, I have these structures. This is what I need. Done so. So that was kind of the basic idea of that model. And I would continue to think that that is like far better than what we currently have, even if it's not perfect. I also think it would be really nice to have actual trans medicine and not cis medicine that's been repurposed, which is all we have for the most part, actually. And I think a lot of folks don't realize that most of the interventions that we avail ourselves of are interventions that were created for cis bodies and cis aims and then repurposed into what we call trans medicine. And so having like a meaningful, well-funded, just very significant program of research that is like by and for trans people that's like, hey, like, what are we actually wanting? And where are the gaps in what we have currently, right? Like a lot of people are very interested in testosterone, but they don't want to lose their hair. So like, what's that about? Is there not any option better? But there's not a whole lot of good research about how to sort of like hit these different places in the hormonal transition, right? So that's just one very, very small example in a very, very huge ocean of topics. And then the spiritual piece, I don't really want my surgeon doing a ritual for me. You know, shout out to my surgeon. He was awesome. Don't want him doing the ritual. Like he's a surgeon and that's his world. But I think that in my perfect world, if every single trans person could be held through the surgical process by ideally multiple people who really could like hold all of it, I think that we would see preparation with regard to like ritual in terms of like, hey, can I look at what this part of my body has meant to me and can I release it and call in some new way of being with this body that feels more resonant to who I am or who I'm becoming, right? And then in the post-surgical time, people have all kinds of things come up. For some people, it's a very uncomplicated, great, I feel better, I'm moving on with my life. For some people, it's like all their ancestral shit hits at that point in the like 2 weeks after surgery. And they're like, holy hell, what just happened? What did I do? That requires a really specific type of care, right? A really specific type of support. So having like a lot of people who really know what they're doing and could come in and hold someone through that, in addition to cooking soup, and helping them change their Band-Aids if they need it. And like in my perfect world, there would just be such a huge number of gender doulas that could just handle all of these different aspects and really hold people through this experience. And there would be free trans healthcare that was of very high quality and that was performed by people who were experts, even if they weren't like also squishy gender doulas, but who knew what they were doing and really cared and saw trans bodies as valuable and worth working with.
Absolutely. You're conjuring a world of abundance, but in a very concrete way, learning to demand a lot because that would be a world better for everyone. I think that's a beautiful place to wrap up this conversation for today. But Eli, thank you so much for sharing your experience and wisdom, but also your very eloquent way of sketching for us, painting for us some wonderful tapestries of possibility. I think hit really nicely in this era where it's really easy to feel pretty dispirited and jaded. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute delight.
That's just about all the time we have for this episode. But before I let you go, just want to remind you can always send us feedback or your topic ideas and your advice, questions, or queries. You can send those to outwardpodcast@slate.com. And just a reminder, if you join Slate Plus, you'll get ad-free podcasts, extra segments on shows like Working, and you'll never hit a paywall on the Slate site. To learn more about that, you can head over to slate.com/outwardplus. Our show is produced by the very wise and expertly supportive Palace Shaw. If you like Outward, please do subscribe in your podcast app. Tell all your friends about it and rate and review the show so that other people can join us for future episodes. But in the meantime, I have to say goodbye, but also stay gay.